Welcome to This Week in Health IT, where we amplify great thinking to propel healthcare forward. My name is Bill Russell, healthcare CIO coach and creator of This Week in Health IT, a set of podcast videos and collaboration events dedicated to developing the next generation of health leaders. Well, we have a special request here. The programming team at This Week in Health IT would like to highlight solutions that deliver hard dollar savings to healthcare in under 12 months. This is in direct response to comments we're hearing on the show, as well as comments I'm hearing in my consulting practice. Before you drop me an email, I need solutions that have successful client stories. I receive about 10 emails a week from companies that want to highlight their product on the show. And my first question is always, put me in touch with a reference client. And amazingly, about 90% of those requests fall away, which I find really interesting. We want to see what kind of response we get from you guys, and then we will determine how we're going to, get this integrated into our programming and get it out there. So, send in your responses. Bill at thisweekinhealthit.com. Love to hear from you. Love to hear what you guys are doing that is showing hard dollar savings, real money savings for healthcare. This episode and every episode since we started the COVID-19 series has been sponsored by Sirius Healthcare. They reached out to me to see how we might partner during this time, and that's how we've been able to produce daily shows. It's just a special thanks to Sirius for supporting the show's efforts during the crisis. Now, on to today's show. This morning, we're joined by Andrew Rosenberg, Dr. Andrew Rosenberg, the CIO for Michigan Medicine. Good morning, Andrew. Welcome back to the show.
Morning. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's, again, thanks for taking the time. I know this remains a very busy time for everyone at Michigan Medicine. And you just returned to the role of CIO after spending a few months really on the front lines caring for patients. What have we learned in the battle against this virus so far?
So I was back in the ICU for about 2 months, and I was still doing the CIO job. It's just I turned over more of the day-to-day to some other people. And I think what I experienced, what I learned is what you read about in the papers. Detroit area was hit pretty hard. Michigan Medicine had a lot of transfers because of that. I think our health systems, most of your listeners, we tend to do crises very well. And everything I experienced was a number of remarkable examples of people coming together from pretty much all parts of the health system to just take care of patients and manage the crisis. From that IT and informatics point of view, though, the thing that was interesting about this one was that, especially as we were trying out new things, I was one of the people using all of the new tools or trying to use the new tools. We stood up, for example, an ICU in one of our surgery recovery rooms, and we were trying to bring in new types of phones, and we were using some of our very early unified communication platforms. The phone, we were using the iPhone, but some of the directory and some of the patient context linking through Epic. And that was the first time we were trying these things out. So everything from getting the phones and even still having a lot of people ask for physical pagers at the same time, yet we were doing a new unified communication. It was interesting to be one of the people calling our help desk and asking and getting logged on and all of those things. So I experienced a lot of that, plus some other things we might want to talk about. Yeah,
absolutely. So, give us an idea of, just some of the technology. We just started a Zoom call, and you guys have implemented some new security. Are there things, in a crisis, we move very fast to stand things up, get them going. We get really creative on the clinical side. What are some things that we maybe experienced over the last 60 days from really reacting to the crisis to more stabilizing and preparing for a second surge?
Well, my guess is that we're like most of your other viewers. We experienced all the challenges of a very, very fast move to remote work. And we all experienced not only the challenges of that, but probably many of the CIOs and other IT leaders were thinking, how are we going to be sustaining this? Because we knew some of the silver linings of this crisis were problems that are now eliminated or at least significantly reduced through a lot of remote work. An example for us that I know is at many other health systems is the patient parking problem, the difficulty of parking in very dense areas of our health systems now, I believe, has been eliminated because much of the non-patient care, non-physical critical work, the work that can only be done in person, has been demonstrably working, and in some cases working even better. So from an IT perspective, what are we going to need to do to sustain that? How do we create new spaces that allow for hybrid work? A staff who typically either had an office or a cubicle or a set space now will not have that, but we still want, and we all know as people, we do also want that physical collaborative work, yet there's some real efficiencies. I mean, here I am, you and I are doing this, and I'm at home and you're at home, and I've been working for 6 hours already. So I think that there are a number of areas there. The other one that's a direct correlate of that is telehealth. In our case, one of the challenges that we experienced, and I've heard at some other places, where some of our big vendors were superb during this crisis. They made licenses free. They really looked for opportunities to just help out. Others, though, clearly were taking advantage of the situation. And frankly, fortunately, those were much fewer. But one of our issues, for example, is right now we have at least 3 telehealth platforms that we could be using. And ideally, we'd like to get to 1. And whether it's the integration with our EHR or just to support remote work, I think one of the challenges that we're all experiencing is how can we try to get to a limited number of platforms and enhance those, their feature set, their security, their ability to work in mobile platforms. That's one that I think we're all dealing with, and it's probably not a bad problem to have, but that's at least one area. The other one related to telehealth, of course, is not just how the workforce supports telehealth, but I'm thinking about those places that have already some pretty mature telehealth. They're reaping the benefits, and good for them for being out in front. We're just okay in some areas. Our ambulatory telehealth blossomed like pretty much everyone else has seen. On the inpatient side, we don't have really rich tele platforms, but we do have several individual ones that could be cobbled together and still be effective. And the challenge I'm working on now, and that's one of the things that I dealt with being in the ICU, several of us got together. We put all of them up into a couple of screens, and we practiced with what would a tele-ICU, for example, look like with Epic, with homegrown systems like our Alert Watch, with T3 that we use in our pediatric ICUs, and how could we GOM together secure web-based cameras so that we would have essentially the feature set of a more matured tele-ICU platform. We have all the features. Now we just need to figure out how to take existing systems, cobble them together, a little bit of governance, and move forward with that. Final example, just before COVID hit, we were already talking about more remote radiology viewing stations at home. And we'd set up about 3 or 6 of them. 2 weeks into COVID, we had 50 up and running. And that's an example of a new workflow that will almost for sure be sustained, because in private practice radiology, more radiologists are starting to work from home. So one can imagine not just imaging, but now talk about digital pathology and other types of image-related diagnostic and care where people will be able to start doing more and more of that from, if not home, different locations. And that's going to be interesting work for our CIOs and other IT leaders to work on. And I think we could probably come up with a couple dozens of those examples.
This is what I love about a conversation with you is you've given me, 6 places to jump off of from here. I'd like to talk about telehealth. I'd like to talk about work from home. I'd like to talk about setting the priorities moving forward. Those are 3 things. And I want to talk about second surge. So I want to make sure to hit those 3 things. So as you talked about work from home. It's interesting. I mean, there are some benefits to it, right? Parking might sound if you've worked in a hospital, you understand how bad parking is and navigation around a campus and those kind of things. And this really frees that up. It also, there's a lot of really expensive real estate that gets used in this. I think people anticipated a significant drop in productivity moving people to their homes, but I don't think we've experienced that. What kind of things are you going to be looking at to determine your future model? I don't assume you're rushing to get everybody back into the office. You're going to, look at certain aspects in order to determine what makes sense to come back and what makes sense to, wait for another day to make a decision on it.
Yeah, one of the great quotes, our deputy CIO said it a year and a half ago, Jack Kufal, he happens to be our CISO also, and we're talking about work from home. And I think maybe remote work is probably the more accurate statement because it really is just that. We talked about productivity. And I love the quote, what he said. It was one of those off-the-cuff comments, but it just resonated with me very much. He said, well, how have we been measuring productivity to date? And I think what it really gets to is that, one, we don't really measure productivity very objectively, but we have a sense of productivity because we just see people physically around. And I suppose to some extent, there is something to be said for when you're expected to dress up professionally. And by the way, I am wearing clothes right now. This is not me, wearing pajamas at the bottom, but when people are professionally dressed coming into the office and you kind of walk by, and in general there's a inhibition to just be watching YouTube videos for 3 hours and going home. There's some degree of external constraint for productivity, but I think the more modern approach, which we were already working on within ITSM in some real sophisticated objective work with one of our other senior directors, Michael Warden, was how do we use our ITSM tooling, tickets, metrics around response time, metrics around first time solution, as opposed to just taking a ticket and passing it along to 3 or 4 people. And I do think that when we start looking at measures of a healthy project, measures of proper process that we can work on and improve upon, those kinds of measures allow someone to manage a more remote workforce effectively. At the minimum, you could say, to make sure you're not getting really bad, poor productivity. But ideally, that's when people start to say, look, before I had a 45-minute drive to work and home, I just have an extra hour and a half of time now freed up because I don't commute. So I can be more productive, and that face validity can then be attached to other measures that we wanted to use anyway around I'll still call it our ITSM tooling. But really, it's a much deeper view around services, metrics, measurable, quantifiable work that what I'm hearing in both talking to a lot of people, but seeing in our productivity measures, we're better. An example, one of our very large data groups have told their senior director, and they were going to be one of these groups who might have stayed at one of our old buildings as we're consolidating into one building. They said, we have no interest in moving back to the old building right now. Let's just wait until we can get into our new consolidated one building for the entire IT staff. And interestingly around that, I was having to argue for a 5th floor in this building to move about 3/4 of our enterprise IT group into this new location. Now I don't have to. That 5th floor, which I thought was going to be very tough to get from a financial point of view, completely take it off the table, and we can move the additional 200 people into the building because we're going to have a much more remote workforce. And what it will likely be, and I'm sure others are thinking this way, it's probably not going to be that a large group of people now are completely remote. Instead, there are people who want to be coming into work, but I think it'll be a more hybrid type work. There will be people, whether it's Monday and Tuesday, it's one team, and Thursday and Friday, it's another, or a lot more hoteling space and a lot more collaborative space. And there will be some formal, these are days where teams come together for team meetings, teamwork, joint sessions. But then there's going to be a lot more work from remote. And I think that overall milieu will overall be a more productive and frankly collaborative milieu for us to work in.
Interesting. All right, so you've touched on some of this around telehealth, and we've seen significant gains. Obviously, virtual visits in the ambulatory setting, everyone's touting their numbers, went from 500 visits to 5,000 or even more than that. In some cases, we've seen tenfold increase in virtual visits. But you start talking about some of the other things which I think are important: remote ICU, remote patient monitoring, things that can keep people maybe at home and provide a better level of care and monitor them. We use chatbots pretty extensively during this as well. What do you think is going to be the long-term impact of having experienced this pandemic and put these technologies really as intermediaries in a lot of cases, or as mechanisms to provide care in different venues? What do you think the long-term impact of the pandemic is going to be on future work models?
Well, I think the one that we'll most talk about, the one that will get the most money behind it, will be all manner of telehealth. We talked about it before COVID. We discussed it from a variety of angles that all made sense: patient engagement, patient satisfaction, efficiencies of a healthcare system, like you mentioned, care at home, something that we've been working on with some of our large payer partners to start coming up with mechanisms for true inpatient type care now being delivered at home. All those things I think are only going to continue to expand. They had a great interest before COVID. They needed an activation energy, to borrow an old chemistry term. And that activation energy was that catalyst actually to overcome the activation energy was COVID. So I don't think we're going back in that. The long-term engine of that will be the financing of telehealth, both professionally, but even from a facilities point of view. I do think some of the benefits are going to be clear to people. I think some of the downsides might be, though, the potential further centralization of healthcare because of the large health systems being able to afford the infrastructures to do this. I don't know what it means to the smaller vital healthcare providers. I don't know what it means to the non-large medical healthcare providers. So what does it mean to long-term care homes and therapy and mental health and some other areas? Although mental health is a good example of one of the more amenable to telehealth programs. My brother's chair of psychiatry at Wayne State, and he said, ironically, that during COVID, his department may be the only one that has not seen a significant financial loss because they've been able to do most of their work virtually. And in some ways, it's even more effective to get some of these types of services out into the community, into rural areas where they're less common. I do think, though, that the area that we're likely to see a variety of different work will be, again, the non-healthcare related remote work. And I'm spending probably as much time thinking about that and all of its efficiencies. An example you said was we have some very new buildings and we have some very old buildings. And the old buildings have always been an issue because they require a lot more maintenance. We felt we needed them. They typically are where a lot more administrative work is done. And to me, that's a win-win where we can start to very quickly move away from higher cost areas and use a lot more technical means to support remote work. There are very few people who desperately wanted to stay in old buildings that cost a lot to maintain them and commute from long distances, as opposed to, for example, our hospitals and our clinics. I do think that there will be new services and new ways of working that will be fundamentally changing to society. We're seeing it in education, both good but also very bad. I've seen a real mixture in how both what we have been needing to support for our medical school, for the most part good, but a fact that there's senior classes having to graduate on Zoom. No one wants to do that. Colloquiums and other meetings where people benefit from all of the pre-meeting and post-meeting discussions and that quick ability to talk to each other and to manage things. No one really wants to only do that remotely, let alone thinking about how are we going to start the next school year for our medical students and our graduate students and our nursing students, let alone being part of the university. That's an example where remote is not ideal. In some cases it is, in other cases it's the exact opposite of ideal. So I see us having much more interesting conversations in some ways around the non-telehealth remote work and what are new tools. You mentioned chatbots. So yesterday we had one of our largest network outages, in fact, probably the largest network outage we've ever had. And I had to deal with that, for about 12 hours, and it took about 24 hours, and it was a power source in one of our data centers. It was a maintenance on power, and we still don't quite know why, but all circuits shut off, and we had a full stop of a scale we've never had before. The impact was that much greater because of how many people now are working remotely. So one of the interesting correlates of all this remote work is we're even more dependent now on IT, on our networks, on our numerous services. And one of those examples that helped out when our call distribution phone platform went out was our chatbots and our ability for people to still, not our bots necessarily, but people to still use chat to get to our service desk. Cellular as a backup spectrum became incredibly important, and I think we'll see that really blossom as we get into not just more and more unified communications, more cellular related, but certainly as 5G starts to trickle in and emerge, we'll see even more applications running off of that spectrum. Now that we're more distributed, now that we're that much more dependent on this kind of work, where will we see some acceleration in those areas? Those to me are interesting questions.
Yeah, no, this is a fantastic conversation. We're gonna end up going a little long, and I'm just gonna keep going because I do want to hit on priorities, how we're going to set priorities, and I do want to talk about a potential second surge and where we're going. So, today's I'm going to give the date that we're recording. This show will probably not go live until next week, but it's May 28th. We're recording this show, 2020. How are you thinking about your priorities for health IT? You had a set of priorities coming into the pandemic that were well thought out, that had, went through governance. A lot of people talked about, and now you have a maybe not a whole new set of priorities, but you have some things that have popped up as a result of the pandemic. How are you going to prioritize the work? How are you going to evaluate all the things that are coming at you at this point?
Well, I laughed at that because I think, like most people, one of the tough parts of COVID is that we're all going through cost cutting, and I'm as much trying to shift that as much as I can to cost optimization type discussions, not just cost cutting. Those tend to be one time. They tend to be disruptive. We tend to get over it, and then yet we haven't really dealt with the underlying issue. So my laugh at your question was that all my priorities before COVID essentially got just completely wiped clean. And during COVID and now coming out of it, our priorities are focusing on what really is core to the mission. And it's a tough conversation because most institutions have a lot of trouble really prioritizing all the what must be done, what's core versus what's nice to have. We're probably as good and as bad as many other good institutions. But from my point of view, what it has done is it's helping me articulate what really is core to our mission just a little bit more. And I've mentioned a few of the examples already. Where we're duplicating, where we have 3 telehealth video platforms, things like that. I'm hoping that this will give us a little bit more clarity to point out what really is core and what we have to focus in on. So that's driving most of our budget discussions right now. The challenge for me, and it might just be somewhat local, is our dependency on technology is never been greater. And yet getting more choices, more priority towards technology and IT and data and information services, and less from manual work, that's still a slow process. An example is doubling, tripling down on RPA type efforts that we had already started, robotic process automation, and frankly, other automating processes. I'm spending a lot of time trying to point that out as a value, not just to get through the budget crisis of COVID, but really set us up into new work going forward. But the final piece to what you also said is trying to think about some of our priorities, whether it's surges in COVID or other disruptions. It's what of the things that we did during COVID can we really demonstrate made us more nimble? And we can point to a good half dozen to dozen of those. And those are the things that we're very, very clearly emphasizing as we go forward. And one of them are the tooling that we've done that allowed our staff to work very effectively remotely and make sure that that only gets more attention and effort.
You know, it's interesting when you say budget crisis in healthcare. For those of our listeners who said, you know, what budget crisis, I would just encourage you to go listen to. We had Rob DiMiche, the former CFO for UPMC, on the show, and he explained it in detail. So just, you know, if you're not familiar with what's going on, we essentially, you know, had the surge. We shut down elective procedures, and then essentially in a lot of areas, the beds did not fill up with COVID patients, and it created a significant financial gap. We're not going to cover that. What I'd like to do is, you know, we're seeing signs that, you know, just from claims data and other things that are going on, from conversations I'm having, health systems are starting to take those procedures back. We're starting to see a increase in elective procedures, which is good. That's the financial health of the organization's important. We're seeing upwards of 85% capacity now, even pushing 90% capacity, which is great. But as we do that, my two-part question here is, how are we going to do that safely? And then the second is, how are we returning to that work while also keeping an eye on a potential second surge?
Well, I think, again, probably we're like many. We had these ideas around 24/7 hospitals and significant more efficiency. So one of the silver linings for us is that as we had built some more capacity over the last few years, we weren't using it really as efficiently as we could, particularly in some of our ambulatory areas. Now, we're reopening our ambulatory sites with full efficiency. And only when we've achieved that do we then open up further sites. And that probably will allow us to sustain a lower cost per unit service, which we've been trying to do before COVID. And I would suspect other viewers are finding those opportunities. And if not, that's something that we're doing actually very well. And I think it gets broad support. As opposed to our hospital, which, like others, we were running at 97% capacity, almost inefficiently full. Now we actually might be able to find some mechanism, plus some of our new analytics, to try to just take a bit of that edge off and stay more efficient. For example, to accept more transfers, to shorten wait times for patients. So I think there's some silver linings in terms of capacity, bed management, transfer management, that this crisis, if we emerge out of it effectively, may help. A similar example that I mentioned before around the 24/7 hospital, while we're not running 24/7, we have expanded services into Saturday and somewhat later hours. And I think maybe people just want to be getting back to work and feeling secure in their work. I don't know how long it will sustain, but if we do it properly, we might sustain it. And that should take down some of those longer wait times and engagement. Those are examples of silver linings that I hope we maintain after the crisis. That will also, with some of the technology points I made before, allow us to not close down as completely as we did before. Better screening, of course, is absolutely critical in anything we talk about at all. Better identification. We've worked with our EHR, as I'm sure others have, to do a much better a collation of data so that a more accurate signal that a patient either has high risk or had COVID will allow us to maintain operations as opposed to shut everything down and only be a COVID hospital. I think those are the kinds of things that we're going to see during the emergence, during any types of surges and spikes, because I don't think the economy is going to allow us to shut down as much as we did before. But it's also, I think, going to help us for some next future items, whether they're infectious diseases or other surges, and be able to manage those more robustly in the future as well.
All right, the $1,000,000 question. My daughter goes to Baylor, and she has been studying this semester, obviously, from home. And, one of the reasons you choose to send a student to Michigan or Baylor is that experience. I guess, as we look to the fall, this is my closing question. So that, there's part of this I'm just curious, are we going to see football in the fall? Are we going to see college campuses open? Do you think that's going to happen?
Well, my daughter was a freshman at Michigan, and she's in music theater, and it's difficult to do music theater, all the acting and the dancing remotely, and it's been very, very tough on that small and elite class. So I, like you, feel this very viscerally. My best guess is that schools that have not announced that they're not going to open in the fall. So those schools that I think are still trying to stay open will try to figure out a way to stay open. And it's going to be very, very difficult from the dorms and the eating halls to the large classrooms. And it's not just for the students, it's for the faculty. I can't imagine how large football stadiums would be able to handle those kinds of crowds. And so my best guess is that schools will try to reopen with public health supported practices, but that the large sport venues, particularly football, will not go forward this fall, which is very tough for so many people, not to mention the athletes, especially in their senior year. But that's, what else do I know? I have no other insight.
Yeah, we're just speculating at this point. Yeah. Andrew, again, thank you for your time. I really appreciate you sharing your experience with the community. It's always appreciated.
Absolutely. Thank you.
That's all for this week. Special thanks to our sponsors, VMware, Starbridge Advisors, Galen Healthcare, HealthLyrics, Sirius Healthcare, and ProTalent Advisors for choosing to invest in developing the next generation of health leaders. If you want to support the fastest growing podcast in the health IT space, most of you can say this now without me even finishing it. The best way to do that is to share it with a peer. Stop right now, send an email, tell somebody, hey, this is a great show. I'm getting a lot out of it. You're going to want to check out these interviews and conversations. The second best way you can do it is you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're putting an awful lot of new stuff out there, and it's exciting. The live show will only be available on the YouTube channel. It will not be dropped into the podcast channel. Some of you asked me to drop it in last time, but my team here internally wants me to stay focused on the strategy, and that is to have content that is specific to YouTube and to start to diversify our channels, if you will. So some of our content will only be available on YouTube. So get over there and subscribe so you know when it's available. Please check back often, as we're going to continue to drop shows on a daily basis through the end of June or until we get through this pandemic together. Thanks for listening. That's all for now.